Hi, I'm Joni Patry, and welcome to our Get Astrologic Now YouTube channel. And today I want to talk about something I'm really excited about. It is that my brand new book has just come out. It's called Secrets of Prediction. And I'm especially proud of this book because in the first part of it, I was compelled to really write about how I got into astrology. Everyone always asks, how did you get into that? And when I really think about it, it goes way back to my childhood. But let me just tell you, in the first part of the book, I go into, it's very autobiographical about my life as an astrologer, particularly being here in the South, in Dallas, Texas, which is very conservative. And I have been an astrologer actually for so many years. But let me start with how it all began. It was November 21st, 1963, and I was around 7 years old. I was watching black and white TV. Yes, there was black and white TVs back then. And I'll never forget Jean Dixon, who was the most famous astrologer psychic of our time back then. She came on TV and she told President Kennedy, do not go to Dallas, Texas, or you will be assassinated. I'll never forget that. And then the very next day, I was born and raised in Dallas. So being here in Dallas, my sisters and my mother all went to greet Kennedy at the airport. So they were taken out of school. I was still too young. But I remember being in class and watching the black and white TVs in the classroom when Kennedy was at Love Field and just walked off the airplane. And as he walked down the steps, he walked into the crowd. And immediately, the first people he walked up to, you can see it in all of the old videos on the History Channel, he walks right up to my mother and sisters. And you can see them clear as day. And my mother adored President Kennedy, and that day the unthinkable happened, and it was the best day of my mother's life and the worst day of her life. And I'll never forget all the tears and sorrow that especially happened here in Dallas. As a matter of fact, across the street from where we lived, the doctor who operated on Kennedy that day when he went into the emergency room lived across the street. So from that point on, I wanted to know, how did Jean Dixon, how did she know? What did she do to try to get this information? So I became more and more interested, always curious about this. Of course, my mother had the astrology books around the house all the time, and she was the same sun sign. Of course, it was Western astrology back then, which was Scorpio, so I started reading the books. And it started making so much sense, and astrology was my passion. And later on, I went to the University of Texas and studied psychology. And once I graduated, I thought I'd take a break before I went to graduate school to become a psychologist, so I started with the airlines. And it got to be such a good deal, let me tell you, it was so much fun, that I continued on for many, many years with Southwest Airlines. But what was really funny was I've always studied astrology, and part-time was an astrologer, part-time flight attendant. But I would always do the chart readings for the girls I'd be flying with. And it got to be a real funny thing that when the girls saw me at the airlines, they all ran the other direction because they thought I could see everything about their life, and it would scare them because they thought immediately I'd start telling them terrible things about their life. So everybody was scared to death of me. And some thought I was a devil worshiper, you know, all that stuff that went on back in the day. But the funny thing is, I want to tell you a couple of stories about some flight attendants that I read their charts. One of them was this flight attendant. I'd heard that she had lost her parents the year before, and her husband had just died of cancer the same year her parents died. So we're sitting in the jetway, and I asked, her name was Lucy. I said, Lucy, do you happen to know what time you're born? She says, yes, as a matter of fact, I do. I go, really? Nobody ever knows what time they're born. So I'm sitting there with my computer on my lap, plug in her information, And that day, Jupiter was exactly on her Venus. And Venus was the planet that ruled her 7th house. So, you know, Jupiter stays in one sign per year. So it takes 12 years for Jupiter to go through the whole zodiac. So this is a once in 12 year thing that hardly ever happens, right? This doesn't happen every day. And I look at her and I said, Lucy, you're going to meet the man you're going to marry today. And she looked at me and she said, first of all, it scares me to death. And second of all, you're crazy. You're nuts. And she laughed out loud. I said, okay. So then I noticed, I went into the cockpit and the captain was telling me how he had lost his wife in a car accident the year before. And I thought, how horrible. And then the very next morning in the hotel, I was having breakfast. I noticed her and the captain going for a walk. I didn't think much of it. A year later, she goes running up to me in the crew lounge and says, remember that time we flew together? You're not going to believe this. And I said, what? She says, well, I'm getting married. And you told me that that day I'd meet the person that I'd marry. And I didn't believe you, but you were right. That was just one of the scenarios, that the reason why all the flight attendants run when they see me. Another one was one time a flight attendant came to me for a reading. She was really concerned about her husband's health. Looked at her chart, said, he's fine, don't worry. He's going to be here for a really long time. She goes, really long time? What do you mean by that? And I said, a long time, way in the future. She said, what do you mean way in the future? I said, okay. Do you really want to know? She says, yes. So looked it up. I was looking up where Saturn was, transiting, and I gave her a date. It was 8 years into the future. I never thought about it. About 20 years later, runs up to me in the airport and says, Joni, remember when you did that reading for me? And I said, yeah. She said, well, you made a cassette tape for me and I listened to it just the other day. Do you know you predicted the exact day my husband died? And I was like, yeah, well, first thing I said is I'm really sorry about that. But yeah, astrology works. So with these stories, all these amazing things have come about, and I talk about all of these stories and even how I predicted the earthquake in Japan, because I have a Japanese website, the month before it happened. So in the first part of my book, it's autobiographical, and I give all these fun stories about being a flight attendant and being an astrologer, and how I used astrology. Then in the second part of the book, I go into how I make these world predictions using the transits and the cycles, and that there's cycles within cycles. We have the grand cycle precession, the outer planets of Uranus, Neptune, slower moving planets. Then we have the Jupiter-Saturn transits. Then we have Mars and the faster moving planets down to the moon, where we can predict exactly the day that things happen. So that's all with world prediction. Then I go into personal prediction, where I can look at an individual's chart and make these grand predictions about everything, about your life and the patterns that your life will take throughout your lives. And the way that I do this is I go through the entire family of the Kennedys, from Joseph Kennedy Sr. and the loss of his children, and all Joseph Kennedy Jr., John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, as well as going on down to John Kennedy Jr. and Caroline Kennedy. And of course, all of that happened to Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. I take the lives of the Kennedys, which are so well documented, and I explain exactly how these different transits and cycles and dashas in Vedic astrology can predict your future down to the day. And with that, I bring it full circle to bring it back to how I got into astrology, which was from that day that President Kennedy was assassinated here in Dallas, Texas. And my biggest question to you and to myself is, what if John F. Kennedy had listened to Jeane Dixon on that day? Is there such a thing as fate and destiny? Can we change the future? No one really knows the answer to that, but I will say my opinion is yes, I think we do have choice, and I think we can use astrology to change our destiny and our future. Otherwise, I wouldn't use astrology. So with that, you can go onto Amazon. You can order my new book called Secrets of Prediction, or you can go to my website and find out how to order my brand new book, which is galacticcenter.org. Thank you.